All right. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be starting the first in a three-part webinar series surrounding a lot of the transitions that happen as patients with Dravet syndrome reach adulthood. And we know that this involves a lot of complex changes in families' life, including changes of transition of medical care, leaving the school system, and also needing to rethink potential long-term options for housing and caregiving. And so last summer, DSF partnered with some families to run a survey just to begin to understand more about what the community's needs are around these issues and trying to understand what families want the most in these transitions. And these are really difficult topics. There's no hard answers, but we thought this webinar series was a great opportunity to get the conversation going. And so today's session is going to focus on post-secondary programming and services for adults with Dravet syndrome. We're going to record all of these sessions. We'll share them on the DSF website as well as the DSF YouTube channel. As far as just a few other housekeeping items, we really want everyone to join in the conversation today. So please feel free to use the chat, use the video and audio functions, and participate in whatever way feels most comfortable to you. And with that, I will, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Brian McSpadden Gardener, PhD. He's going to lead the presentation and discussions for this series. Brian and his wife, Karen, are just now embarking on a lot of these transitions with their 17-year-old daughter who has Dravet syndrome. Brian has a background as an agricultural scientist, so he understands a lot about the importance of data. And I think that his combined life experience and those expertise are going to make him really ideal to help lead these conversations. Like I said, there's no simple solutions, but we really hope this is an opportunity for people to share, discuss, and begin the planning process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you, Veronica. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And what we're going to do here is start off with some introductory slides. And I'm going to briefly just take people off the picture, but I'll bring them back on as we get to the questions portion. First, I'd like to thank the Dravet Syndrome Foundation for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of what we learned in this survey this summer. I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions that parents have as they raise their children with Dravet, and particularly a little bit of uncertainty about how to approach those transitions into adulthood. Now, let me start by pointing out that there are several key transition points for patients with Dravet. The first, of course, is the initial seizure onset, which alerts caregivers to the special needs of their child. Then comes the diagnosis of Dravet syndrome, and thankfully to advances in medical science and with good advocacy for the community, this is happening earlier and earlier. With our own daughter, who's now 17, she didn't actually get diagnosed until she was 12, and there are other young adults that weren't diagnosed until much later. So this is an important point because the seizure management and the care that's required for Dravet patients becomes a lot clearer when it's understood the nature of the underlying seizure disorder. And then, of course, children move on into schooling and get a lot of support services. And this will vary a lot from community to community. There are some school districts that are very good about providing supports around special education needs and providing paraprofessionals to support teachers in caring for children with special needs. And unfortunately, there are areas that are somewhat lacking in this. But today's discussion really is about moving towards those age-dependent transitions, the first of which occur in early adulthood as the Dravet patient approaches the ages of 18 to 22, because it's during this period that a lot of changes go on. There's a shift from pediatric to adult medical care. There's also the shift from the public education and supports to other community programming supports. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time today discussing. And then further down the road, there's also transitions in later adulthood. And this is where there's perhaps the greatest amount of uncertainty for a lot of our parents, because the improved medical care that Dravet patients are getting now are allowing them to live fuller and longer lives. And that's raising questions about how will their care and their management be handled further in the future. And we'll touch on some of those issues today as well. So the place to start with this discussion is really the survey that we did this past summer. In that survey, there was feedback from nearly 200 American caregivers. And most of the results that I'm going to focus on today are from those American caregivers. And that's simply to help frame the discussion around what we know the most about. And we hope that to some degree that this also provides some guidance for those who are living outside of the US. The distribution of the patient ages and the description of the patient situations were pretty much evenly distributed across the entire survey. So that's good. It means that this is a very valid survey. And one of the big take-home messages from the survey was that there was a degree of uncertainty and anxiety about these adult transitions. Roughly a third of the questions were answered as unsure. And whether it was about programming or housing in the future, people were not always very confident about how to answer them. Not that they hadn't thought about it, but that they really didn't know where they were headed. And it was also indicated that nearly 3/4 of the participants answered all 30 questions, which meant that 1/4 wouldn't even know how to approach some of the questions or found them so difficult that they avoided even answering unsure to those questions. So I think this just reflects the natural challenges that parents and caregivers have with raising their children with Dravet. What we did clearly get out of the survey was that whether we're talking about the near term of about the next 5 years or the longer term, which may be 20, 30 years down the road, that most caregivers feel that the parents will remain actively involved, though over time, they're going to shift from active primary care to supervising, involving more aides and or active monitoring of care outside of the home. And again, as they look further into the future, the degree of uncertainty also increased with regards to their answers. Now, the good news, of course, is that medical advances are improving treatment and care. We get more accurate and earlier diagnosis. We have better seizure management. And in fact, there are more and more reports of infrequent seizures, and especially in patients who are getting diagnosed earlier and getting the proper medications earlier in their lifespan. And that brings a lot of hope for people. There's also continued investigations on how to improve whole family care, recognizing that it's not just the patient, but the whole family dynamic that's affected by Dravet. There's also good news with regards to societal services. In the United States, we do have federal Medicaid and Social Security payments that help support the care of people with Dravet. There are state waivers and county services for developmentally delayed and differentially abled adults that can come into play. And there are also private foundations and faith-based supports, including groups like the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, all of which can be drawn upon for support to help manage the journey into adulthood. Today's discussion is going to be focused on post-secondary programming and services for those with Dravet, and we'll come back to discussing future webinars at the end of this. So, The goal for the webinars are to consider some of the relevant survey results to establish a baseline of our understanding and the opinions of the community as they exist today. We also want to have some more experienced caregivers, those who are working with adults who are already 21 years or older, share their experiences and perspectives on each day's topic. And then at the end, we will allow caregivers who are joining us in this conversation to ask additional questions and share their opinions. The goal ultimately is to provide a record of how people approach this journey and work together to find solutions that work for them and their families. So with that introduction, let's talk a little bit about the survey as it relates to programming for young adults with Dravet syndrome. The first question that I would like to draw our attention to is how satisfied people are with the programming options for adults that have Dravet in their area. And if you look at the level of satisfaction, you'll see that again, approximately 1/3 are unsure about the nature of the quality, primarily because about 2/3 of the respondents haven't actually gotten involved actively in that adult programming yet. If you look at the degree of satisfaction of those who know something about the programs in the area, you'll see that there's a fairly high degree of dissatisfaction as relative to general satisfaction with that programming, indicating that there's aspirations for programming and support that are not currently being met. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about with current adult caregivers as well later in this session. As we broke down this level of satisfaction by age group of the caregivers, those who have the youngest children and those who are dealing with adults, what you see is that the degree of uncertainty remains fairly high throughout, but that the aspiration of being satisfied increases as you approach those transition periods, and in some instances decreases as they first get involved, indicating that perhaps some of the services that they thought would be a good fit for their child turned out to be not as good as they had hoped. The next question is to think about, when do our community members foresee a need to change the programming arrangements for their adult child? And this pretty much follows the pattern of the expectation of the parents by their own age. The number of years is indicated on the x-axis here. As you get closer to the adult transition period, people become very aware that it's coming up soon. But then there's, again, as the child gets into their late 20s and early 30s, a recognition that there'll be some other changes going on as the adults get into old age. Notice again too that there's a good number of people who think that the transition is coming up fairly soon and they want to be prepared for them. And that's really what kind of prompted these webinars. Lastly, with regards to the social and educational programming arrangements, we ask questions of all of the survey participants of what types of programming they'd like to see in the near term, meaning less than 5 years, as well as the longer term. And you'll see that disproportionately, they all felt that there would be a need for adult day programming. This is akin to time with professionals that can care and support and enrich the lives of their children, not unlike the experiences that they have in the school system when their children are younger. There is some interest in seeing some work training related programs. The level of interest was highest amongst those who had children who had the least severe expression of seizure disorder. So those who had the fewest number of seizures and or were highest on the developmental and performance scales. Others who had much more severe expressions of the disease did not feel that work training would make sense for them. There was a good amount of support and recognition that having a personal aide for their child would be useful. But almost as much felt that family support would be the only educational support that they would be able to provide. This is probably a reflection in part of the economic opportunities that are afforded to different families and the differential in the amount of supports available in different communities. As we asked about the aspirations of different students, how would they characterize the different program supports for you and your adult child? Most of them felt that having a full-time personal aide would be ideal, or at least a very good fit. They also felt that arts and recreational programming was an ideal or a good fit, and that for a subset, part-time aides and vocational training were generally viewed as a poor fit, but there were some that felt that it would be useful for them. There was also a sense that there was a need for rapid medical support in emergencies that, again, was weighted more heavily to round-the-clock nursing support, but both are important given the limited self-care ability of patients. The ongoing physical, occupational, and speech therapy is something that also people thought would be a good fit for their children as they age. Again, a desire to see an enrichment of their child's life and an ability to function and to gain some degree of contentment with what they're able to give and share with the broader community. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to have Veronica introduce some of our more experienced caregivers who have adults with Dravet syndrome to share some of their experiences and their perspectives on today's topic. In advance of this, we shared with them a series of questions, and we will ask them to address these questions as we move forward. So Veronica, would you be kind enough to introduce our first panelist?
Yeah, so first, it's my pleasure to introduce Janice Stanley. Janice, would you like to tell us a little bit about your daughter and what you guys have been through with these processes so far?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Janice Stanley, and my daughter is Emily. She is 23 years old. She was diagnosed at the age of 5 years old. And right now, just so you know, her seizures are pretty well controlled. Up until about 5 years ago, she never had a seizure that resolved without medical intervention. And so it was critical. She always had a one-on-one nurse at school and everything. But within the last 5 years, her seizures have reduced to less than 5 minutes and do not require medical intervention every time. And that's really important because that's a major factor in programming for our children, is what state they're in medically when you're looking for programming for your kids. So Emily has a very busy week. She was in the transition program at school, and during COVID, she was not paying attention. She'd shut down the computer and stuff. And so we actually moved her into a day program a couple of years ago, where she could really actually still be in the school programming transition program right now. But we were very fortunate. I had researched day programs many years ago, and she was on several waiting lists. And they had an opening. And so because she wasn't doing the transactions at school anyway, I put her into the day program. She started at 2 days a week, 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. And now she's up to 4 days a week, and she's on the waiting list for the 5th day. It's been a wonderful program for her. So her basic week is on Mondays. She does not have program, but she goes to a social group 2 times a month. And then on 3rd time a month, we meet at a restaurant or in a home and do cooking and social activities. This is a group of parents that we've kind of done this on our own. It's not through an organization, but there was not a lot to offer. And so we just developed our own group. So those 2 Mondays, she goes to a farm, she feeds farm animals, and she does crafts and stuff like that. But that's all parent run. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she now does after school programming or after program programs. So from 2:30 to 9:30, they keep Emily. I'm sorry, 2:30 to 6:30. And so on Tuesdays, she does a social group, and on Thursdays, she does exercise and swim. On Wednesday night, she is in a cooking class through the Northwest Suburban Rec program in our area. On Fridays, she gets home at 2:30, and that's her family time. On Saturdays, she's currently in a Challenger baseball program, which is also a parent-run organization. And on Sundays, I formed a bowling group for the adults in our community. And so we meet on Sunday evenings and the whole families bowl together. The third question, what does she do well and what brings her satisfaction? I have found that if I keep her busy, then I keep her happy. So I'm purposely keeping her in as many activities as possible and filling up her day. Also, the very simplest things in the world, like stickers and stuffed animals, stuff like that, bring her a lot of joy. Sometimes when I try and do too much for her, she's very overwhelmed. And so like a birthday party, Christmas, all the like fun things you try and do, actually make her really anxious, and her behavior comes out. So the negative things about her and what she struggles with is her behavior. Her seizures are much better, but her behavior has gotten really bad over the last few years, up until we did a medication switch about a year ago. And now her behavior is getting back to being better again. Before that, it was a lot of physical aggression towards the family members, not so much out in the world, but at home, a lot of crying and a lot of just really bad anxiety. Her behavior was her biggest struggle. What advice would I give someone on the Dravet? I have lots of advice. I'm only going to give you a couple things here, and I'm sure other things will come up as you ask questions later. One is to research possible day programs and other programs early, because the best ones have waiting lists. And unfortunately for our kids, the best programs are the hardest ones to get in, because it's a competitive process. They take the most well-behaved and the highest functioning non-medical kids first. And it's just a matter of economics. They can serve more of those kids, and it's a business. And even though they're wonderful people, it is business run, a lot of the programs. And so get on the waiting list early, talk to the other parents, and just start as early as you can. And then the other thing is, like, we started all these clubs on our own and all these activities. And I would advise you, if you can't find things through Special Rec, Best Buddies, Special Olympics, all of those things, to get out with the other parents. There's always parents that are looking for the social aspects, and that's been very, very beneficial for Emily. A lot of the problems with the programming when you get out of school, what people don't realize is when they say the bus stops coming, it literally stops coming. Transportation to programs is huge. So look into transportation. The one-to-one aid thing goes away. They don't provide that in a lot of cases. A lot of places do not have any nursing available, or they have nursing from like a lot of programs I looked into had nursing from 10 to 2, and the program ran from 8 to 4. So literally they would have no one there. She has no nurse at the program she's in now. If she has a seizure, she has to call an ambulance or whatever. And so, like I said, I have a lot of other advice, but I'll just leave it at that. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Janice.
Thanks so much, Janice. It sounds like Emily has quite the social schedule. You keep her so busy. Thanks for sharing all that. I'm sure we'll circle back with questions, but let's go through our other panelists first. Next, I'd like to introduce Colleen Penwell. Colleen, would you mind to share a little bit like Janice did about your family's situation and how you're navigating some of these transitions?
Sure, and thanks so much for organizing all of this and including me. It's just a great resource, and one that many times I've reflected on and thought, oh gosh, I wish I had some of this when my daughter was younger. So I'm Colleen Penwell. I live in Madison, Wisconsin with my husband. We have David. We have 3 children. Our oldest daughter is 26 and lives out of state. Working. Our middle daughter, Grace, has Dravet, and she lives in Madison, and about a little over a year ago actually moved out of our house and is in a supported adult family home. So she has an apartment with several other women with cognitive disabilities. And then I have a son who is a senior in college and also lives out of state. So that is actually the family dynamic part is interesting as if you have other children, as they age and move on with, some of their life goals as well. Our daughter Grace was diagnosed, sadly, not until the age of 12 as well. And so, that's one of the things like, gosh, had we known, when we found out in so many ways, it was kind of like a label at that point because we were just managing it all, and there were still so many unknowns that we just kind of kept going. So I feel like we were later in embracing the Dravet Foundation and really kind of accessing some of the great resources. In terms of Grace's week, again, Grace is very busy. So we have had it's been a particularly intensive transition time. So because she moved out of our house, and that was, as some people have heard me say, not for the faint of heart on so many levels. Her week now, and I can fill in the blanks back some years, but she actually works. And I will say that, every child is different, adult is different. Their severity of their Dravet case varies, obviously. Grace developmentally, I would say, is about age 5. She's verbal. She moves around fine. But she's not a reader. But she does work. She has her own business. And so I do notice oftentimes that sometimes the vocational part maybe is underplayed or underemphasized. And had somebody brought up to me vocational opportunities when Grace was even in high school, I would have said, are you kidding me? What would the options be? And so sometimes I feel like until you have the right person sort of guiding you and providing supports, sometimes you don't know what the options are. So that's just kind of an aside. Grace has her own business, as I said, and she's fully supported every day with a job coach. So she gets picked up at her apartment. And again, there's care providers while she's at her apartment all the time. She gets picked up at 8:30 in the morning, and she gets dropped off in the afternoon at 2:45. And she has her own business called Gracie's Goodies. And it is a snack delivery business. So imagine sort of like a concession stand box where it's like the honor system pane. And she has different businesses that these tabletop concession boxes go on. And so with her job coach, she goes and refills the boxes and collects the money. And then every day at the end of the day, she takes her little envelope of money and takes it to the bank and goes in all by herself. And so it's worked out very well for her. And then when she gets back to her apartment, she actually works by far the most out of all of the women in the building. She has some downtime, and again, she has support people there, but she too is very busy with Special Olympics. She's in a little theater group called Inspiring Hope, where one night is like a theater group, and then the next night is like visual arts and crafts and things like that. She's in a game group and a movie group and a bowling group. So again, she's very busy. And then the other part of her life that's really flourished too is that she has these housemates that live in the same building as her. And so there's some really cool natural supports that have started to come from that, whether it's watching a show together or having a meal together or having some of the families come together. So that's been significant. As far as what she does well and brings joy and satisfaction, she's uber social. She is just very, very kind and sweet and really likes to talk to you. So that, serves her well. And that's why her business is really good for her. She loves everything Disney. She loves her family. And I mean, those are just a few things. As far as what struggles she has, I didn't touch on where she is kind of on the Dravet scale. And I think this is also really important to emphasize with folks who have younger kids. Had anyone told me that how significant the changes would be as she reached adulthood in just her seizures, I would have maybe not believed you. So Grace used to have, like so many Dravet kids, seizures, without any rhyme or reason throughout the day with no warning. And that was her whole life. And they were, big generalized seizures. Around mid-high school, so like probably let's say 16, 17, she started to have a significant, as you may have heard of as people reach adulthood. In her case, she only has seizures now at night when she's sleeping. Occasionally, if she's napping really hard, she could have one during the day while she's napping, but 100% only when she's sleeping. And that's been the case for probably 5 or 6 years, which is just a massively significant change. So that's really impacted her. So in terms of struggles, I would say maybe fewer seizures and maybe able to control them more because they're at night. Her speech continues to decline some of her motor things decline some. And then in terms of, behavior, there's independent living kind of things and just kind of some compulsiveness and perseveration that we really struggle with. But in general, I would say, she's kind of living her best life right now. Knowing what we know today, what advice? I would say start early. In the process of learning what's out there, as Janice said, finding those parent groups, looking for organizations in your community, because as we talked about, they do vary so much from county to county, state to state. In Madison, we feel, I don't know what I don't know, but we feel like there are a lot of supports here, and that might not be the case. And don't assume that something's going to be a certain way. As I mentioned, the seizure thing, the seizures themselves changed so much, and that had a massive impact on what her daily life could be like. Don't start now having the conversations with the rest of your family about, thinking ahead, hopes and dreams for your child, but also for the family. And if you vanish tomorrow, what would that look like? What would Grace be doing? What would her life look like? So that there's open conversation. That's a huge thing. Now that Grace has moved out, I would say one thing I really have learned that I have a lot to learn about is appreciating baby steps and, not going right to the end game, but realizing as I reflect back, just even on the last year, the number of baby steps in progress that Grace has made. We never in a million years would have thought she could be doing some of the things she's doing. And also, as you're approaching the transition, particularly like in high school to adulthood, someone gave us, our case manager gave us some sage advice and said, if you feel like Grace is going to ever be moving away from home, for example, or working more, start to have supports coming into your house more beyond just the family members, which seemed weird because, we all have that feeling of how weird is it to have somebody else in my house while I'm here too. As far as peer mentors or support people. And we did do that, and it really did pay dividends as she continued her transition, both out of the education system and as we pursued living away from our home.
Great. Thank you very much, Colleen. Veronica, do we have one more panelist today, or should we move over to questions that are coming up in the chat?
We have one more, so let's get Marianne Mascus, who many of you are probably familiar with through her role as the executive director at the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, but today she's acting as a parent panelist to tell us a little bit more about how they've been navigating this in their house. Thanks, Marianne.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne Mascus. I have a 22-year-old son with Dravet syndrome, who is the youngest of our 3 children. He was diagnosed at age 4. At this point, both of his older siblings actually live out of state. And so right now our household is primarily he, myself, and my husband and our pets. For him, a typical week now, we are transplants and now live in Western North Carolina, but for the first 20 years of his life, we lived in Illinois. And so after navigating COVID and getting him set up with programs in state, he just recently started a day program about 2 months ago. So he attends that Monday through Friday from 8 to 2 p.m. Within that program, they do a lot of community activities, including hippotherapy, which we used to do as a separate activity when we were still in Illinois. So really, it seems like most of his day kind of is wrapped up in that 8 to 2 period. I am not as good as Janice with organizing all of these other events or finding those other activities. And since we're newer to this particular community, I haven't had an opportunity yet to connect with other families of disabled adults, but I'm hoping that I might be able to find that and might be able to expand some of his socialization a little bit, because that is certainly what brings him joy. Is he's very social. He likes to be out and about. He likes to chat with anyone who will chat with him wherever we are. And he also just likes to have a pretty set schedule. Like, he likes to know when he wakes up in the morning, he's going to go to school. And when he comes home, we're going to go outside. He really does not like a lot of significant changes unless there's something that he really looks forward to. So like some of the other panelists have mentioned, we really struggle with that OCD and perseveration. Our biggest issue is certainly behavior, and anytime there's a transition to something that he doesn't want to do, that's really our biggest struggle. I don't have good advice on how we've been able to work around that. We certainly, have spoken with the folks at his day program, and they know that they can sometimes redirect him or offer a reward that will help with that. But that is certainly the biggest challenge across the board for everyone involved in his life. And I think, like some of the other panelists had said, kind of where we're at now, I think my biggest advice would be to start early. And I think also taking the time to reimagine the options. I think for me, it's been very difficult with his needs, especially with his seizures at night. I know, like Grace has as well. I have a hard time imagining anyone could care for him at the same level that we do. And I think I did a lot of comparisons to my husband's uncle, who had before he passed, had Down syndrome and was just much higher functioning. And so I would look at some of the things that they had set up and put in place for this uncle and would think, Elliot just does not fit in that box. So how are we going to contend with his care as we get older and finding a place for him to live? And I think that really kind of limited my thinking. So I think, thinking about how can we approach this in a different way? Colleen's experience has been very inspirational to me, and thinking, okay, maybe there is a good placement out there for him. So I think starting to think about it early, not being afraid of it, and really just trying to think about what might work and how you can adapt things to work for your child.
Absolutely. So Marianne and Colleen and Janice, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I think a big part of what we're doing here today is just helping people recognize that there's more than one path in front of people, and there are lots of opportunities. And so hearing about your different experiences and the different opportunities that you've had is probably quite helpful to some of our listeners here. So just going to the chat here, there was a couple of questions that came up. First for Janice was wondering if you pay for Grace to be at the home, and how do you look for organizations that might be involved with adult programming in your area?
So I'll do those separately. So in Dane County, where I live in Madison, we have, it's called IRIS, is the and I can't ever remember what the acronym stands for, but that's our sort of funding source. So she has a budget that is based on assessment of need. And then she also has her Social Security and all of that. And so there is a lot of financial support based on her very large needs. So that's how it's funded. And the way it works here is that like Social Security dollars cannot be used to pay, or IRIS dollars cannot be used to pay rent. Like you get your Social Security dollars and those are supposed to be for your living expenses. So, I mean, do we fund a lot of it or support? Of course. But you know, she does get financial assistance through what's out there. In terms of parent groups, was that the question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I should look. Okay. So again, in Madison, as I said, I feel blessed. It does seem like there are some groups that are really came together, like kind of what Janice has talked about on an ad hoc, but this is more formalized, and it was like groups came together on their own, some parents, and now they've actually become formalized organizations. One is called Love, L-O-V, Inc., and that is a group of parents and adults with disabilities. It's a nonprofit, and they provide programming, and they do different seminars that I've talked about before with some of thed groups. One is on kind of preparing for after you leave the school system. It's called Moving Out is one of them, on just evaluating and learning about all the different housing options that are out there, because there are way more than I even realized. And so, and just once you gain that information, figuring out, okay, could any of these fit our situation? And then another one is Fearless Futures, which is kind of creating that Bible of everything about your child. So like if you vanished tomorrow, the rest of the world would be able to somehow, you know, keep the person going. And then, you know, then it seems like there's just offshoots, like there's Special Olympics. Well, then it's like there's some parents organize some additional activities around the Special Olympics groups. And then one dad started a movie group. And so it's really trying to mine what's out there in your community. So if you have, for example, like the ambassador, finding a Dravet ambassador, or somebody else in the special needs world in your area who might be able to help you and give you some suggestions. But it does make a big difference.
Yep.
Did I answer that correctly? I'm not sure if I touched on it.
That was all very helpful. I'd just like to add to that, in our area, the public schools as well as the county boards of disability have actually introductory programs where they've done actually Zoom tours of the adult day programs in the Central Ohio area. And so we've been able to visit over a dozen programs from the comfort of our dining room table. And so sometimes there are those services already in place to help you get connected, but you do have to look for them because they vary so much from place to place.
Can I just add to that as well?
Absolutely, James.
In Illinois, sadly, we're one of those states that are really low on the disability totem pole, and the average adult in Illinois does not receive funding until 5 years after they become 18. And so they aren't even able to look for they're not even allowed to be on the waiver program waiting list until they turn 18. And so in Illinois, the last time they had a poll for child waiver services was 12 years ago. And I understand they just did their first one. And so in Illinois, it is a very long wait, and it's far after the transition period of school ends that people are getting funding for services. I was very fortunate. Emily got into services way, way early, but that is very unusual. And like I said, it's been 12 years since children were pulled from that waiver program. And so that adds a huge level of stress and problems for people in Illinois, because they basically are keeping their kids at home because they can't afford to send them to a day program that they have to pay out of pocket for. And when I started this, when Emily was in high school, I went and looked at many day programs. And there is such a huge range in the quality of services and what they provide. You really have to do your research. Again, it's very competitive. There are waiting lists that are, very long. Some of them were no better than just having a bunch of people with disabilities sitting in a room and making sure they kept them alive, just like babysitting. Some of them are work-based programs where they're like sat at a station, like in a factory, and they're doing like little, picking a color wedge and putting it in a bucket kind of tasks. And so it was a lot of really eye-opening discoveries that I made when I was looking for programming. And some of them are really bad. The program I found for Emily, like I said, was very competitive. We had to be on the waiting list. Then we had to interview. Then they had a month-long trial period. And then they could at any time say, no, she's not a good fit with the program. And so for a child with a medical issue or behavioral issues, it's very difficult. And from some reason, the grace of God, Emily behaved for a month straight. It was a miracle. And so, I just feel really bad for people who are in a state where there isn't the funding and aren't the opportunities. And therefore, as parents, we did come up with a bunch of different activities for kids, or I should say adults, but it's very sad. And I would actually advise people who live like in Illinois, if you're not on the waiver yet, maybe move out of Illinois and get on a waiting list in a different state with better opportunities. Because then once you have the waiver programming and the waiver funding, then it's difficult to move because you get on another state's waiting list. So if you do move out of state, you start over.
And that's perhaps, if we could have Marianne just chime in very quickly, that is the last question that had popped up about when you move to a different state, how easy or difficult is it to get waiver support services, or do you have a perspective on that beyond North Carolina?
Sure. So I can tell you, in Illinois, we were fortunate, like Janice, and actually thanks to Janice's prodding, that we were able to get Elliot on the childhood waiver before it was closed. My understanding now is there's a wait of over 19,000 in the state of Illinois to get your child on that waiver. So at this point, you're pretty much guaranteed, unless something catastrophic happens, you're not going to get services until they're an adult. And so we were on that waiver past his 21st birthday. And so all of his services transitioned because of being on the childhood waiver to the adult waiver prior to our move to North Carolina. So when we moved, it certainly it was very easy for us to update his SSI and his Medicaid services, because those had all actually kind of taken place prior to our move. The waiver program was a little bit longer of a wait, and I'm not sure if that is, I think it was blamed more on COVID actually than the services that are available and the fact that they were short-staffed during COVID. Mm-hmm. But because, for instance, we had to wait, they wouldn't accept a psychological examination in Illinois. And we had an almost 10-month wait to get in for an appointment for that. So it took us about 18 to 20 months to get all of that situated once we were here, as far as the waiver program, and then enroll him into a day program.
Yeah. Well, these are very important issues, and Colleen had brought up housing. That will be the focus of the next webinar. And then the last webinar in this series, we're going to come back to planning, because of course, as Janice pointed out, the earlier you think about the steps in these transitions and what is actually needed in your area, the better prepared you'll be to make a smooth transition. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to move on to the last section of this webinar, which is, again, allowing all of the members of the audience here to participate, because, again, there are questions around when should we be starting to look for post-secondary programming. And I would like to keep the focus on the programming side. Again, we'll talk more about housing next time. But then also talk a little bit more about what adult day programs look like. How do aides contribute? What kinds of programming do you think would work well for your child? What would you like to see? And what do you have in terms of concerns around medical supports or training for those who are involved with the adult day programming? Because this is one of the issues that I think comes up time and again, whether it's looking for summer camps for youth or adult day programs, is do they have the personnel with the right training to deal with the level of care that your child needs, given where they are on the spectrum of Dravet? And then questions about managing transportation and payment we've begun to touch on. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and open up if there's anyone from the rest of the audience that would like to either comment on any of these issues or highlight which of these questions would be important. This would be a great time for you to do that.
I know I've already spoken, but maybe regarding the first point, when does one start looking into the programming options? I would really encourage parents. I didn't really understand what transition was, and I feel like it's becoming a topic. I guess I was just really uninformed. I didn't understand the lay of the land and how that works. So as soon as your child is, in high school, I would start inquiring about how this all works, because it varies from state to state. And if they say they don't have any kind of 18 to 21 program, so basically programming that goes after high school or the traditional end of high school, ask, like you have to here, but just start really, really pushing it. And then there also, one other thing regarding transportation, that is a massive issue here, like a deal breaker for a lot of families as far as their programming, even where they live, because it's, within a certain distance of a bus line and things like that. However, same with the transition inquiry, start asking and investigating options for transportation right away, even if you don't know exactly what is going to be in the works for your child, because that's where you can start to get creative, possibly. We didn't know that it was even an option, for example, for Grace's vocational agency, her job coaches, to pick her up. We thought we would have to figure out some kind of paratransit or something. Well, they can. We just didn't know. So you have to start asking questions and learning a little bit on that, because there may be more options than you realize.
Brian, I just wanted to mention for the families that aren't aware, earlier this year, DSF had gotten together a small group of parents of adults with the idea of putting together, a checklist, like similar to what we offer for our newly diagnosed patients. But what do you need to know as your child transitions from school to adulthood? And we've had a couple of iterations of it. We discussed it at the conference this past June, and we actually have a version coming out that we will be linking in our next newsletter that goes out mid-month. We would love for parents to take a look at it. I mean, I think it's a very helpful list, but what we've seen all along is there's always something that we could add to help make that process easier. So if everyone has the opportunity to review it and has any feedback, we would certainly love to hear it.
Great.
Brian, one thing I would like to mention that I didn't know when I went through transition with Emily and just learned now with Tommy, my son, who's 19 and is in his first year of transition, who has Down syndrome. There's options for the transition program. When Emily was in her high school IEP meeting to go to transition, they basically didn't give me a choice, and I wasn't aware there were choices. And it turns out, you know, I would have much rather have been in a different program, but I didn't even know, like I said, that was even available. So now Tommy is in a different transition program, and it's night and day difference, the way that they are getting him ready to be an adult in the world. And so like, you don't know to ask unless you know to ask. And so part of the reason in our thing is that we are a special education department. Instead of our high school doing it, it goes through them. So the whole staff of the IEP meeting was from the special education district. So they weren't going to advertise there was another transition program. They just assumed our kids would all go to theirs. Just so, you know, people know that there are choices, but you have to ask. I mean, they're supposed to tell you, but sometimes they will not.
Yeah. Does anyone want to just touch briefly on the type of programming that they think would not work well for their child? The reason why I'd like to bring this up is it was alluded to that there were lots of different types of programs out there. And I agree with one of the statements that was made earlier that some just really don't look like a good fit. Some because they're just holding pens for adults with disabilities, others because they're just not a good match for people who have seizure disorders. There's a great program here in Central Ohio where they're essentially a doggy daycare, and you can have people who are good with animals who perhaps are not triggered by their allergies to have seizures. It would be a great fit for them, but it wouldn't be a good fit for our daughter as an example. And I didn't know if anyone else wanted to speak to issues of things to think about for kids with Dravet, both the ones that they are caring for as well as others that they may have seen.
One thing they have in our area, we actually haven't taken advantage of it, but I know lots and lots of people who have, and it's not specific to Dravet, but they're called either support brokers, or there's a group called Bridge Builders here, because there's been a lot of discussion about in the world of disability, people are very well-meaning and create this social group or this outing or this. And so it's very like activity specific. And it's, you know, checking the box of your kids being busy and doing X and Y and Z. And there's some thinking related to the idea of, well, really learning and understanding what is it, the true interests of the young adult. So I don't know, great if somebody liked beading or something. Well, that's probably a bad example, but actually, I know of a young man who was super into computers. And so like there were all of the different, you know, check boxes of activities that existed. But it wasn't until that family connected with a support broker to go out into the community and find actually like a computer club, I guess it is, of so it's not just other folks with disabilities. And the job and the support broker kind of stays with that person and provides the support that that person needs, with the idea that eventually they kind of back off. If some medical supports and things like that are needed, of course, that's taken care of. But it's sort of flipping on the head the idea of, you know, one size fits all for activities with people with disabilities. And this idea of really what is it that's interesting for Emily and versus what Grace is interested in. So that I thought was kind of intriguing.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because our kids are all different. just like our more typical kids are all different. And so it's really both a challenge as we look forward to Anna's development, to again help get her to a point where she says, this is what I would like to do, and this is what means something to her, because that kind of contentment is really what you really hope for, regardless of the nature of the child.
Mhm.
Well, I'm really fortunate because the program that Emily did end up in is called the Choice Program. And basically every day when they get there, they get to choose the activity they want to do in the morning, and they get to choose the activity they want to do in the afternoon. And they're given 3 different choices. And then one time a week, they do a full group outing. So they go to like the pumpkin farm or something. Like this week, they're doing that. But other days when they're just at the program, they can choose between like doing a craft or doing a physical activity or doing a book reading or something like that. So everyone gets choices every day. And, you know, they do encourage them to try new things from time to time, because Emily would just choose the exact same thing every time. But I love it because they do have that choice and they do have that voice then of what they want to do. And it's also recreation and socially based, rather than some programs are more vocationally based and some are more educationally based. But for Emily, the social recreation program worked out best for her.
Great. Well, again, at this point, we're getting near the end of the hour here. Again, if you have other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll try to address them before we sign off. But I did want to just let you know that wherever you are in your journey with Dravet, know that there's support available, and that working together, we can all make things better. So again, thanks to all of our panelists for participating today and sharing their experiences. We will be getting together again on October 20th to discuss housing. And Veronica, would you like to sign off for us?
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for being here. Like Brian said, I hope to see all of you again on October 20th. And then again it's November 15th, I believe, is the last part of the series. I'll send recordings out as I send reminders about the next upcoming ones, as well as I'll post the recordings on our Facebook groups as well. And please, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. My email is veronica@dravetfoundation.org. And a special thank you to our panelists who helped navigate through what their experiences have been, and to Brian for leading the discussion throughout. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.